gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. President. It brings me no joy to rise to say I told you so, but for nearly 5 years now, Americans have been paying the price, quite literally, for the Trump-Biden tariffs on imported steel and aluminum. And let me just remind my colleagues that tariff is just a word that we use sometimes to obfuscate the fact that these tariffs are just taxes on American consumers, a tax they pay when they purchase something that has the tariffed material in it. So I want to make 3 points about this today, Mr. President. First, that taxes generally, and these taxes in particular, do tremendous economic harm. Secondly, these taxes have been imposed by presidents from both parties and imposed unilaterally, increasingly, and without so much as a vote by the Congress. And third, this is all about to get much worse. This is what happens when Congress willfully abrogates its constitutional responsibilities over trade and tax policy to the executive branch. So let me start with the economic costs. So the fact is, there's no serious dispute in the economic world. These tariffs, these taxes, do much more harm than good. Now, I know supporters of these tariffs, including now the Biden administration, they will argue that this is necessary to protect American jobs. That's what they'll say. Well, there are roughly 140,000 workers directly employed in the steel industry in the United States. That's a big number, 140,000. But there are literally millions of American workers in industries that use steel or steel inputs made of steel, and their jobs are jeopardized by the higher cost that's created when we tax these products. By the way, these millions of Americans who work in the industries that use steel, they outnumber steel workers by a ratio of roughly 80 to 1. That's what we're talking about here. The Peterson Institute estimated that for every job saved by the Trump-Biden taxes on steel, the cost to American consumers was $650,000. Obviously, many times more than the average steel worker salary. And these costs are all paid by price increases for consumers. They also cost people their livelihoods. By one estimate, the job losses from these tariffs alone have been as high as 75,000 jobs. This has included a lot of jobs, thousands of jobs, in my state of Pennsylvania. So I ask my colleagues a simple question. Is it ever really fair for the government to intervene in the economy in a way that ranks one person's right to earn a living higher than another person's? Is that really what this government should do? Decide who gets to have a job and who doesn't? It's not a close call. It's flat out morally wrong for the government to be deciding which Americans get to work and which ones don't. And that's what's happening here. It's also the case that this unilateral imposition of these taxes by presidents is being done with a completely dishonest justification. These tariffs have been increasingly imposed unilaterally, as I said, by presidents who hide behind a national security rationale. That's what they say. In other words, to add insult to injury, these taxes have been imposed not through an act of Congress, but by executive fiat, and an executive fiat that's based on a completely false premise. Why is this the case? Well, because there's a deep flaw in a Cold War era law. The law is called the 1962 Trade Act, and it has this section called section number 232, and that section permits the president to impose these tariffs or taxes on a product if his Commerce Secretary decides that the product is a threat to the national security interest of the United States. Now, that sounds like a reasonable idea. It's been applied in ridiculous ways. Mr. President, I would suggest it is ludicrous to assert that our national security is harmed because we import mostly small quantities of steel and aluminum from allies like Canada, Mexico, Brazil, South Korea, the EU, Australia, Japan, many others. But you don't have to take my word for it. You could take the word of someone who's absolutely an expert on national security, former Defense Secretary Mattis. He agrees with me. In a memo to President Trump's Commerce Secretary, he urged against imposing these tariffs on steel and aluminum. He noted that the U.S. military needs for steel and aluminum are met with a mere 3% of America's domestic production of those metals. So let me put this a different way. It means what we manufacture domestically, the steel and aluminum that we make in America, is more than 30 times what our military needs, our defense needs. How could you possibly argue that these small quantities that we import on top of all that we make is a national security risk? It's ridiculous. And by the way, over the past decade, we've consistently produced anywhere from 70 to 90% of the steel we consume. Let me say that again. If you look at all the steel that we consume in the entire United States of America for all purposes, and it's a very long list, we make 70 to 90% of that steel. And there's a national security threat to import these small other quantities to supplement what we produce? Of course it's not. It's completely disingenuous. And frankly, invoking national security as the justification to impose these taxes on Americans is a slap in the face of small businesses struggling to stay afloat, those small businesses that have to buy this steel with these taxes on it, which they sometimes can't afford. The manufacturing workers who are laid off as the input cost rises and their product is no longer competitive. The exporters who see their markets shut off because foreign countries retaliate against these tariffs. It's terrible policy. And there's another problem with this, Mr. President. It's reasonable to ask a question. If the president can falsely invoke national security for the sake of imposing these taxes on steel and aluminum, is there anything that he can't put a tariff on using this justification? I mean, if he can use a false justification, I mean, you could falsely allege almost anything is related to national security, I suppose. Recent court decisions have implied that if there is a limiting factor, the administration certainly hasn't found it. In fact, the previous president seemed to think that after imposing tariffs, he could go back and double them or maybe triple them for any reason or for no reason at all. This is what's happening. It's exactly what the former president did when he doubled the tariffs he had earlier imposed on Turkish steel and aluminum. When this was challenged in a court, a majority gave him a pass, but one judge had a very incenseful dissent. He disagreed in writing, and he said, and I quote, "I fear that the majority decision in that particular case effectively accomplishes what not even Congress can legitimately do, to reassign to the president its constitutionally vested power over the tariff. I dissent." End quote. That judge is exactly right. He's exactly right. There's a separate instance where a judge, wanting to underscore the lack of any limiting principle on a president's ability to misuse this Section 232, he asked during an oral argument if the president could invoke national security under Section 232 to put tariffs on peanut butter. The lawyer defending the tariffs for the administration either couldn't or wouldn't directly answer that question. I know why he wouldn't answer the question, Mr. President. The reason is they didn't want to acknowledge even the possibility that there could be any limits on a president's ability to misuse the national security clause from Section 232, even if it's on peanut butter. So where does that leave us today? Well, I regret to inform my colleagues that this complete abandonment of any pretense that national security actually has to matter for the purposes of imposing these tariffs, the pretense is gone when the hypothetical case of peanut butter, but now it's arrived in reality and it's a lot worse than peanut butter. This is a whole lot like the administration is pursuing Section 232 tariffs on carbon dioxide emissions. Now, it's under the auspices of the Trump's 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum. The U.S. trade rep has just proposed a preliminary agreement with the European Union for a, quote, they call it carbon intensity regime for steel and aluminum trade. Here's how this would work. The new regime would use the threat of ultra-high tariffs on the steel and aluminum from other countries as a way to coerce them into implementing the administration's preferred climate policies. It's beginning to look a lot like Christmas for climate activists. In short, the administration's proposal creates a new trade club for countries with so-called green steel and aluminum. And even though they won't admit it yet, they're using Section 232 to justify this. Now, for countries to join this exclusive club, countries need to do three things. They need to prove that their carbon emissions for steel and aluminum fall below some level that the administration will conjure up. Second, they need to implement low and zero emission requirements for steel and aluminum in government procurement. And thirdly, they need to demonstrate that they're taking a hard line on trade remedies. Now, if a country qualifies for this club, congratulations. Your steel and aluminum will be subject to taxes on American consumers of between 0 and 25%, depending on your emissions. If you don't join the club, either because you can't qualify or you don't want to be saddled with these costs, why then Americans will be taxed much more severely. For countries outside the club who want to sell steel and aluminum, Americans will have to pay 25 to 70% taxes on those purchases. Mr. President, this idea has all kinds of very serious problems. First and foremost, it is a completely unbridled overreach of authority by the executive branch. The Office of the U.S. Trade Rep is clearly asserting that that office has power to establish carbon emissions policy for the U.S. and our trading partners. Last time I checked, even the EPA doesn't have that authority. Where does the USTR come off with this? They're also abusing the conditionally delegated national security powers to enact this sweeping tariff policy, which is the responsibility of Congress. Second is that the economic harm from this proposal is going to significantly compound the harm inflicted by the current 232 tariffs that are already in place. First, it will result in a regime of increasingly managed trade in steel and aluminum that'll probably benefit a handful of select producers and a huge loss to everyone else. It'll hit many of our allies with increased tariffs, and that will result in retaliation against American exports. It'll devastate American manufacturers and downstream users who rely on steel and aluminum inputs for their business. And most importantly, it's going to dramatically raise prices for consumers at a time when inflation is still out of control. What makes this whole scenario really particularly egregious is that Congress never once voted on it. Not once. Not one of my colleagues in this body or the other had the opportunity to go on record either for or against these, in fact, had any meaningful say in this. Now, I suspect some of my colleagues are perfectly okay with that. But, Mr. President, as I warned my colleagues on both sides of the aisle years ago, this abuse of Section 232 will haunt us like a protectionist Frankenstein unless Congress reins in executive abuse of this law. Now, let me be clear. It's never appropriate for a president of either party to use national security authorities to achieve unrelated policy goals. To be dishonest about what's really going on here is not acceptable. Past presidents used to understand this. Prior to President Trump, the last time a U.S. president used Section 232 to restrict trade was back in 1986. Since the Trump administration, we've seen these national security investigations, which is the precursor they need to check their box so that they can impose these tariffs. We've seen these investigations on uranium, titanium sponge, power transformer components, vanadium, magnets, and then perhaps most absurdly, automobiles and car parts. Because I suppose if you drive a Toyota in suburban Philadelphia, that makes you a threat to American national security. Well, as George Will asked in a 2019 column lamenting executive overreach under this very section of our trade law, he said, "What's next? A tariff on peanut butter?" Well, it turns out we already have pretty high tariffs on peanut butter, but now we're going to raise taxes, even higher on steel and aluminum, and use trade law to enact climate policy while we're at it. Mr. President, it is well past time for Congress to reassert and to accept its constitutional responsibility over trade and tariffs. We can do that by requiring that the new Section 232 tariffs, including the Biden administration's carbon plan, that before they go into effect, they have to be approved by Congress. What's wrong with that? The Constitution says it's our responsibility. Why not require an up or down vote in Congress before these taxes can go into force? I've introduced bipartisan legislation that would do exactly that, but if we fail to act, our constituents are going to keep on paying ever more expensive prices. I yield the floor.